to this video demonstration. Today we will be painting clouds, and in particular the clouds that happen around about sunset. The clouds we will be painting will not be around the sunset but on the other side of the sky. For me, this is often where the most interesting and subtle tones and shades happen. The image we are using is an image I took whilst at Cromer Beach, and this is at the beginning of October. This time of year is absolutely beautiful for its light, and Cromer, which is on the Norfolk coast in England, is well known for its beautiful light and wonderful sunsets. When we're painting it outdoors, it's a totally different scenario. We have that sense of movement and all around vision. However, from a photograph we have to imagine being there. The materials we're using today are gouache paints, although you can use acrylic. You can also use watercolour as long as you have white paint. I'm using a limited palette of 3 colours plus white. 3 primary colours, so that is blue, ultramarine blue I'm using, permanent red and permanent yellow. I'm using a round medium here, and this is synthetic hair. I'm also using a round smaller brush. I'll try and do most with one brush, but I'm keeping that brush there just in case. I'm going to start very lightly to begin with. And the first place I usually start my paintings is just above the horizon line. Sometimes we sketch out our scene, but here we're going to go straight into laying some colour down. So what I want to get is this very pale yellowy pink colour that is just above the horizon. So to do that, and again I'm going to work in a slightly watercolour way to begin with. I'm going to pick up a touch of yellow and a small amount of red, and into that just a touch of white, and this is getting close to the colour I want. The first thing I want to do is really just to mark out where that horizon is by putting in this very light wash. So now I've got that in, next thing I want to do is to go down a little bit, and you can see that the sky turns slightly pink. We're not going to be able to get the colours absolutely perfect because of the limited palette we're using. So I've taken some red here, and I want to be very careful with this because it's a strong red. I'm adding a touch of white to it, and again working in a very fluid way. I'm just going to, at the bottom and lapping over this yellowy colour, just put a line of this pink in. There we are, and the water kind of blends into it there. I'm not going to bother putting the mauve in, which is just beneath that pink just yet. The next thing I'm going to do is start working upwards, and as we get upwards the blue starts to become stronger. There's 2 ways to do this. One is to take the yellow up, or to bring the blue down. I'm going to use the second option because it's easier to work from stronger to lighter than lighter to stronger. So I've got some blue here, and again this is not going to match perfectly the blue that we see in the photograph, but we work with the materials we have. I've got a nice pale blue here, and I'm going to start at the top of my page and just wash that blue right across the top, like so. Now I'm just adding a bit more white into that blue mix, and I'm going to take it from the bottom here. Don't worry if it looks streaky. Again, this is just really the backdrop. Now I'm just going to rinse my brush out, And just with water, I want to take the gap between the yellow and the blue, just kind of mix the yellow and the blue together a little bit. So we're beginning to create a backdrop for our sky. I just want to let that settle slightly. I'm looking now at my line here where the pinky orange is meeting the horizon, and you get this very dull violet colour. So to make that violet, I'm picking up a bit of blue and I'm putting it over here into this already wet red. Again, we're working almost like we would do with watercolours. And now I've got this mauvey colour, a little bit more blue in there. I'm going to take my brush and just drag that right across. And whilst that's still wet, take a touch more red with a little bit of white in it. And just on the top of that line there, drag that across. When I look at the sea, it's a very, very strange colour. It's quite hard to make out. There's elements of green in there, blue, but there's also elements of the sky reflected. Now, rather than getting too caught up in getting it perfectly, what we're going to do is just lay a basic bluey green down. And again, we can modify this as we go along. So the first thing I want to do is take some blue, nice and thin again. So I'm working with very thin paints. Into that, I'm going to add some yellow. So this has turned it into a greeny colour, a little bit more blue in there. I'm going to take a touch of white, a little bit more blue again. This is the kind of colour I'm looking for. So that was blue with a touch of yellow and a touch of white. And we're going to be very loose with this and just wash this colour right over the surface. Take it up as far up to the horizon line as possible. The nice thing about mixing colours like this is that when you lay them down in this more watercolour way, the pigments actually start to separate a bit. So you can see here that it's slightly bluer and it's slightly more yellowy green here. As we let our sea settle down, we can start to look up at the sky again. Looking at the blue up in the sky, I really want to make that slightly bluer at the top and slightly more opaque. In gouache painting, to make something opaque, what you need to do is simply add some white to it. So I'm going to take some blue here, and again working quite thin, but I'm working slightly less thin this time. So I've got my blue here, and into it, there we go, I'm adding some white. The more white you add, the more opaque it becomes. So starting at the top again, I'm just going to lay this colour, and I'm using the side of my brush just to drag this colour across. You can see there that adding that opacity is helping to block out the white of the paper. I've done a nice line across there. As it comes down, it gets lighter, so I'm going to add some more white to that mix. And again, just to bring that across and try and blend it into the blue that I've already put down. You see a very subtle change in the lights there. I'm actually leaving some of the gaps of the other colour beneath coming through. This helps create more depth in our painting. In the photograph we've got this much lighter area, and the blue actually transitions to yellow It's very difficult to get this without turning it green, so we want to be quite careful. I've picked up a healthy portion of white there and just mixing it into my blue. Now I'm going to take just a touch of yellow and put that yellow there. Again, just bring it across, side to side brush movements, and just bringing it at the bottom of my blue. And now I've got this more yellowy aspect to the blue. Touch more yellow in there. I want to then, right at the bottom, do the same thing. I want some of that yellow from the previous layer to shine through. This helps me see that the transition here isn't as clear as I want, so I'm going to pick up a little bit more of this lighter colour and try and just drag it across the top of my sky. It's at this stage we start to think about some of our darker elements. For me, one thing I'd like to pay attention to is the colour just on the horizon, which is that violet colour. To create that, I'm using my smaller brush. I'm just going to take a bit more blue here and put it into this mix that I've already got, and into that add a hint of red, and then I'm going to take this line right across the horizon. It's a subtle violet colour. Now to that violet I'm going to add a little bit more red, and then just above my horizon line I'm going to drag this across, but just leave a few little gaps here and there. Now I want to add a slightly pinker element there, so I've taken some red and added a nice amount of white into it. Again, I'm just dragging that over the top. I often get disappointed of not being able to get the colours perfect, but nature, the light in nature it's just so brilliant that it's very difficult to match it with the pigments we use. But we try our best and we get as close as we can. Now just above the pink I'm going to create this orangey yellow colour. I'll start this side this time and just drag that over here. And I see that the pink really needs to be much more, I mean it's a kind of an electric pink which we're not going to be able to get. But I just want a slightly stronger pinky element in here. Whilst that pink is still wet, I'm just taking my smaller brush and I'm going to start from this side with some water on the brush and just try and make this blend slightly. And again, we're going to do the same thing above the pink and into the orange. I'm taking my larger brush this time. I've got it wet and I'm just going to, with a wet brush, just drag that across like so. So that's beautiful and subtle. I'm going to come back down into our sea. So working with similar tones that we used before for the sea, we're going to build up a little bit more complexity. Even though we'll add elements of white, this time I really want the sea to be much more transparent. So we take some blue, and again we're working in a kind of a watercolour style with this. Add a little bit of yellow to it. That's It's made it too green. So I'm just going to blend that in there. And then add a touch of white. Now working across again, we're going to put some of this colour in with a really fluid brush. Right up near the horizon is this dark line. So I'm picking up my small brush again and adding a bit more blue to this mix. Right on the horizon line. Just drag that across. I'll continue with my small brush and look for a few areas of darker in the sea. But you see how much of the previous layer we're leaving in with the sea. So now for our next step, so we can really work out where the dark and light shades are, is I'm going to put the headland in. So to create our headland, I've taken some blue and added a bit of yellow to it to create this dark green. So I'm going to rely on greens complementary here, which is red, just to tone that colour right down close to a black. Something interesting happens with complementary colours. Green and red are complementaries, as are blue and orange, and yellow and violet. When you put these colours together, they complement each other, make the other one seem more vivid. Something interesting happens though when you take a complementary and mix it into another. The result is that it actually cancels the intensity out, and this is where, with a limited palette, you can make your blacks and greys. So I've got this dark tone here for my headland. To create it, I'm going to slowly start to feel the headland out, starting at its tip here. I'm using a small brush, and with this small brush and wet paint, I'm just creating the top of the land and then kind of filling in the bottom here. Needs to be a bit taller up there. Okay, we don't have to get it perfect as it's an impression. And what we'll do is just drag my brush along the bottom right over here. So we'll let that settle down, as we do with all aspects of the painting. So I've just realised that my video had stopped recording, which is very frustrating because I'd just been putting the clouds into the sky. Now, to catch you up with what I've done, I'm going to go through the process again. To create these clouds, or the beginning of the clouds, were just sitting on the sky. The first thing I'd done was I made a violet colour. You see that the clouds are this grey, slightly violet colour. To create that, I've taken a blue, and into it I'm adding some red to make this beautiful violet. I'm going to rely on complementary colours here. Violet and yellow are complementaries. Together, next to each other, they stand out, but when you add a small amount of the complementary into another, it cancels it out, so you get these grey black tones, and this is how we make dark blacks and greys using a limited palette. Into that I'm adding a small amount of white, and I've made this lovely grey tone. What I've done to create the clouds, and I'm going to add an extra cloud in to demonstrate. So I use the tip of my brush just to feel out the shape of the cloud like that with this dark grey colour. There we go, so it's just feeling out a shape. Doing one there. And then what I've done is I rinse my brush off in the water, and I just took off the excess water with a paper towel, and whilst this is still wet with a little bit of water, I've just dabbed over it to soften some of those edges of the clouds. I'm going to now just try and blend that one into the background a little bit, but the process was, and I'll show you again down here, well, I'll do one here actually. I've added the grey in a very fluid way, and then I've taken my brush, rinsed it out, and then just dabbed over the surface. It helps create this real subtle mix. We're now going to let the cloud settle and go back to some other elements. I'm going to look at my water. I don't want to do too much to the water, I'm kind of happy with it. Again, we could take this painting in many directions, but I want to keep it fresh and quite simple today. I'm going to do something though, just to get a bit of sparkle on the surface of some of the elements of water. I'm picking up my white paint on a dry brush, so it's important that your brush is dry for this. I'm just dragging that dry white paint over the surface. It creates a subtle sparkle. You can see actually there's a really light bit right near the horizon. So going with that dry brush, just dragging it across. We've used white very sparingly in this painting. In other demonstrations I've done, we've used a lot more, but today it's just used in moderation for effect here and there. Whilst I'm using the white, I want to do something quite subtle to the area just above my horizon, and that is to create a very thin wash of white over. So I've got a relatively wet brush with a small amount of white on it, and I'm just going to drag this over this area here. See immediately how much a bit of white changes it, but I want that to blend just into my sky a little bit more. There we go. It creates again that sense of subtlety that we're looking for. I'm now going to go back to my headland, and I want to create slightly more opaque mix, and to do this I'm just going to use the paint thicker than I did before. I'm adding some yellow into my blue with a touch of red in it. So we've got this lovely dark colour here. Now on my headland, because the headland tends to come down like this, I'm just add a few diagonal marks here and there. Now looking at my water, and this always happens, need a few slight darker tones just there. It's actually, looking at the photo, it's actually a little bit of beach that comes up against that headland, and it is a greyish colour. So I'm using that dark that I use for the headland to do a very subtle line across here just to meet up with this headland. Hope you enjoyed that video. It was a slightly different style to normal, using much thinner paint. This is something I would capture whilst out in situation, and then probably use it for another painting later. It's all about trying to capture the subtle shifts in light and tone and do it in a way that you're not too precious about it. The more fluid the paint, the more subtle shifts in light you can capture. When you then translate that into a bigger painting, it helps you to see the different tones and the different lights at that time of day. So really this is a practice for when you're outside. If you learn how to work fast and quite freely, and you'll also be able to use these paintings for larger paintings when you get home instead of relying on photographs. Thank you for watching.